There was a time when every tired man came home to a hot plate that told a story. What happened to the dinners that once held the whole day together? Hamburger helper Stroganov was the shortcut to comfort, neatly tucked into a cardboard box on the pantry shelf. It was ground beef browned in a skillet, noodles that boiled soft in the same pan, and a creamy sauce packet that somehow made it all feel like more than the sum of its parts. This was not about gourmet. It was about getting something warm and filling on the table in under 20 minutes. For working families of the 1980s, that mattered more than anything. Kids grew up knowing the sound of the stove clicking on meant hamburger helper night. It meant mom or dad had just clocked out, peeled off steel-toed boots, and needed something easy that still felt like dinner. No one thought twice about additives or sodium back then. The creaminess was the point, and the boxed magic made even a lean paycheck stretch into something satisfying. A little parsley sprinkled on top made it look fancy. It was cheap, it was dependable, and it was loved. The sauce stuck to the noodles clung to the beef, and the whole dish clung to the memory of dinner time when life was simpler, harder, and strangely fuller than now. Corned beef hash with fried eggs was not glamorous, but it knew how to hit the spot. Pulled from a dented can and dropped into a hot skillet, it crisped into a salty golden crust that stuck just enough to remind you it was real food. This was a meal built for exhaustion, the kind of dinner a dad would fry up with one hand while loosening a work tie with the other. When the eggs hit the pan, sunny side up, they sizzled loud and smelled like morning, even at 7 p.m. The yolks were the sauce. The hash was the bed. It looked like a mess, but tasted like home. It came from lean years, when money was tight, but taste could not be compromised. Nobody asked where it came from, just if there was enough for seconds. A couple of slices of white toast made it complete, and maybe a splash of hot sauce if you were feeling bold. It filled the kitchen with the scent of something familiar, something fried, something earned. These were not meals for guests. They were meals for the people who built the house and kept the lights on. Turkey divan was how leftovers became legend. You started with dry bits of Sunday's bird, some broccoli from the freezer, and a can of cream of chicken soup. Then came the magic. A cheese sauce, sometimes called Mornay if you wanted to sound fancy, poured over everything and baked until bubbly. It came out golden, rich, and smelling like someone tried. That mattered. It was a casserole that masked fatigue, dressed up scraps, and made Tuesday dinner feel like Thanksgiving's secret encore. Dads liked it. Moms knew it was efficient. Kids just remembered the gooey forkfuls and how broccoli did not taste like punishment when it was drowning in cheese. In the 1980s, dishes like this were culinary glue, binding time, taste, and tradition. Turkey divan did not make headlines, but it made memories. The kind you recall when you open a fridge of leftovers and wish you could call your mother to ask how she made it taste so good. It was never just about cleaning out the fridge. It was about warming the room, feeding the family, and reminding everyone that even the scraps had value. Tamale pie walked a beautiful line between comfort food and rebellion. It had the soul of chili, the base of cornbread, and just enough spice to feel like a protest against boring dinners. Ground beef, tomato paste, corn, black olives, and sometimes green chilies were all dumped into a pan and topped with a thick layer of cornmeal crust. It baked into a bubbling mess that hit every part of the tongue. This was the meal moms made when they were tired of bland and needed to shake up the week without blowing the budget. The Tex-Mex vibe made it feel exotic to a Midwestern palate, and the fact that it could all be made in one dish made it a winner. Dad would call it zesty. Kids would pick out the olives but still go in for seconds. No one cared that it came from a can, a box, or the back of a magazine clipping. It was bold, it was hot, it was cheap, and it made the table feel a little more alive on a plain old Tuesday night. Cheesy broccoli rice casserole made vegetables feel like an indulgence. In an era where frozen veggies were the norm and kids turned their noses up at anything green, this dish was a miracle. Cooked white rice, thawed broccoli, a can of cream soup, and a heavy chunk of Velveeta, all stirred together and baked into a golden, bubbling casserole. It was thick, creamy, and just salty enough to satisfy a tired adult and trick a picky child. It smelled like warmth, it looked like effort, and it tasted like someone still cared. The kind of food that stayed hot even after you came back for seconds. It was never elegant, but it was loved. The dish could stretch to feed 5 or just 2 with leftovers for the lunchbox. No one bragged about it, but everyone cleaned their plates. In houses where money was counted and casseroles were king, this cheesy, starchy wonder was the great equalizer. Even dads who hated broccoli grew to respect this one. Stuffed shells were dinner that looked like love. Not the quick kind, but the kind that took time. Boiling pasta, mixing ricotta with egg and herbs, ladling sauce, sprinkling cheese, and sliding it all into the oven. It was the kind of meal you made when the paycheck landed, the weekend started, or you wanted everyone to sit down at the table together. There was always enough to feed a neighbor or save for lunch the next day. It was filling, rich, and made a kitchen smell like a promise. The shells held the ricotta like little pockets of warmth, and the red sauce bubbled around them like a hug. No shortcuts, no mystery powders or packets. Just pasta, cheese, sauce, and the kind of effort that said, "You matter." Dads appreciated the leftovers. Kids fought over the browned edges. Moms quietly savored the first bite before anyone else sat down. It was a dish for gathering, sharing, and holding on to something solid in a fast, loud world. Liver and onions was not a favorite, but it was a standard, especially in homes that believed in iron-rich dinners and cleaning your plate. The smell hit you first, thick and unmistakable, filling every corner of the house. Sliced beef liver tossed in flour, fried in bacon fat or oil, and topped with sweet caramelized onions. It was the meal you endured rather than craved, but it had a purpose. It came from a generation that did not waste food or nutrients. Dads grew up on it. Moms cooked it because it was cheap, and kids ate it because you do not get dessert otherwise. The texture was dense, the flavor was deep, and the onions made it bearable, even tasty for some. It was not trendy, not fun, and certainly not pretty, but it fed the body and the spirit of thrift. There was pride in eating what others would throw away. Liver and onions asked you to be grateful, not picky. It was dinner that reminded you life was not always sweet, but it was always worth chewing through. Tater Tot Casserole was a symphony of simple. Ground beef browned in a pan, mixed with cream of mushroom soup, spread into a baking dish, and crowned with a perfect grid of frozen tater tots. It was like meatloaf and hash browns had a baby and raised it in the Midwest. The tots crisped in the oven while the filling turned into a savory, creamy mess. No one could resist the golden crunch followed by that hot, rich bite underneath. It was not just food, it was folklore. The kind of dish passed down from Aunt Susan to Cousin Mike with pride and a little grease stain on the recipe card. It was unfussy, easy to stretch, and beloved by the whole family. Dad called it stick-to-your-ribs food. Kids just wanted more ketchup. And Mom, exhausted from the day, knew this was one of the few dinners no one would complain about. It was not pretty, it was not healthy, but it was home. Chili mac was dinner by way of desperation and genius. Elbow macaroni boiled soft, chili ladled thick, cheddar cheese melted on top, and somehow it worked. It was the food of cafeterias and quiet weeknights when there was not enough chili for everyone or not enough pasta to go alone. So they married, and it was perfect. A little spicy, a little cheesy, all warm and filling. It sat heavy in the stomach and heavier in the memory. Dad would go back for seconds with a beer in hand. Kids would get orange cheese on their shirts and not care. It was not a recipe as much as a solution. A way to make do, stretch the good stuff, and still feel full. In the 1980s, that counted more than presentation. Chili mac was not trying to impress. It was trying to get everyone fed, fast, and happy. Fried Bologna sandwiches were the poor man's ribeye. You sliced the Bologna thick, tossed it in a skillet, and watched it sizzle until the edges curled like petals. Slapped between 2 pieces of white bread, maybe with a slice of cheese or a squirt of mustard, it was hot, greasy joy. It smelled like lunch trucks and childhood. This was not health food, it was real food. The kind made after overtime shifts or between bus rides when money was short and stomachs were loud. Bologna was cheap, but fried. It became something else entirely, something smoky, savory, and deeply American. It hit the table fast and disappeared even faster. Moms made it for lunch. Dads made it after work. Kids made it after school. It was dinner for people who worked with their hands and lived paycheck to paycheck, but still deserved something hot and good. Macaroni and stewed tomatoes was what happened when money ran out, but dinner still needed to appear on the table. It wasn't fancy. You boiled the macaroni, drained it, and stirred in a can or two of stewed tomatoes. Maybe you added a pat of butter. Maybe you fried up some onions in leftover bacon grease if you were lucky. The salt was generous because that's how you made it taste like something. This was a Depression-era holdover that didn't leave quietly. It stayed on stovetops well into the 1980s because it was easy, dirt cheap, and somehow comforting in its plainness. For some kids, this was their first lesson in "we don't waste food." Leftover noodles from last night became tonight's meal with a can opener and 5 minutes of heat. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't even really satisfying. But it filled the belly and warmed the kitchen, and that was enough. If someone grated a little cheddar on top or threw in a pinch of sugar, it was practically gourmet. No one bragged about it. No one wrote it down. But ask anyone born before 1975 and they'll tell you, it kept them full on nights when paychecks didn't stretch far. Salisbury Steak TV dinners were the bachelor's banquet, the dad's dinner for one, the exhausted mother's silent truce with the microwave. They came in compartmentalized trays, Salisbury steak swimming in brown gravy, a scoop of mashed potatoes with a dimple of margarine, and a side of peas that somehow never defrosted evenly. You peeled back the foil, popped it in the oven or microwave, and 20 minutes later, you had a meal that looked like food. Maybe not tasted like it, but looked like it. Kids ate them cross-legged in front of the television while Wheel of Fortune spun on. Dads came home from the night shift and slid one into the oven because it beat frying an egg. These weren't luxurious. They weren't healthy. But they were consistent, and in a world full of unpredictable bills and layoffs, that mattered. The meat had a spongy chew, the gravy stuck to everything, and the mashed potatoes tasted like nothing at all. Still, it filled the plate and shut up the hunger. It was food with a fork. And when the world didn't feel warm, the glow of that TV tray, hot and humming from the microwave, almost did the trick. Potato pancakes, crispy, golden, and sizzling in a cast-iron skillet, were where leftovers became a family ritual. You could use leftover mashed potatoes from last night's dinner or go old school with grated raw potatoes, onions, eggs, and a little flour. Either way, they were slapped onto a hot pan, fried till the edges were lacy and the inside stayed soft. They weren't fancy. They were peasant food, and proud of it. A little sour cream or applesauce on the side if you had it, ketchup if you didn't. You ate them with your fingers when no one was looking. Sometimes they came out heavy, like hockey pucks. Sometimes they were light and crispy like something from Grandma's better days. In Eastern European homes, they were tradition. In American kitchens, they were improvisation. You made them because you didn't waste food, and you didn't waste time either. They reheated well in a pan and even better in a kid's memory. You didn't call them latkes unless it was Hanukkah. Otherwise, they were just potato pancakes, fried in oil, made with whatever was left, and eaten in silence, except for the crunch. One bite and the past came rushing back, hot, crispy, and deeply familiar. Eggplant Parmesan was the dinner that looked like it took all day but was secretly built on shortcuts. Frozen breaded eggplant rounds if you could find them, jarred marinara sauce, a bag of shredded mozzarella, and maybe some Parmesan if it wasn't too expensive that week. You layered it all like lasagna, sauce, eggplant, cheese, repeat. Baked it till the edges bubbled and the kitchen smelled like you knew what you were doing. It was meatless, but no one complained. It was heavy enough to count. Kids picked around the eggplant for cheese. Dads ate it with white bread and butter on the side. It was a Friday night special when money was tight or a Sunday dinner for Catholics avoiding meat. The eggplant always went soggy after reheating, but no one minded. It filled the belly and stretched a few ingredients into a tray big enough to feed 6. Some called it Italian, but it was more like American survival with a red sauce. It looked impressive, tasted decent, and made you feel like you'd pulled off something grand. Even if it came from the freezer aisle and took 20 minutes to throw together, that golden cheese crust gave it the shine of love. Cream chipped ham over toast was the sort of meal you could smell from the driveway, and not always in a good way. You started with thin-sliced lunch meat, chipped into ribbons, usually from the deli's cheapest bin. Tossed it into a bubbling white gravy made from flour, margarine, and milk. Stirred until it thickened like pudding. Then ladled the whole mess over white toast or biscuits. The salty ham melted into the sauce. The bread went soggy fast. And somehow, it all worked. In factory towns and Pennsylvania kitchens, this was a staple. They even gave it names like SOS, stuff on a shingle, though the S didn't always stand for stuff. It was a working man's breakfast, a quick lunch, or a thrown-together dinner when time and money both ran out. The kids didn't ask for seconds, but they didn't go to bed hungry either. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even really appetizing. But it was food that stuck with you, literally and figuratively. And on cold nights, with the news humming in the background and the toast steaming on a chipped plate, it reminded you that even a mess of gravy and scraps could feel like a warm hug. Ramen noodle stir-fry was the poor man's lo mein, the college kid's weeknight miracle, the single parent's ace in the hole. You started with a packet of instant ramen, any flavor, though chicken or beef were the classics. Toss the seasoning packet or save it for something else. Boil the noodles till soft, drain them, then fry them up with whatever you had. Frozen mixed vegetables? Perfect. A leftover hot dog? Toss it in. A splash of soy sauce and maybe some garlic or hot sauce if you had it. Suddenly, you weren't just eating ramen, you were making dinner. It was quick, it was hot, and it felt like an upgrade. You learned the ratios over time. Too much soy and it got salty, not enough oil, and it stuck. Sometimes it burned, sometimes it sang. You made it in hand-me-down pans on flickering electric stoves with a baby on your hip or the TV blaring in the next room. It wasn't gourmet, it was resourceful. The kind of meal that made you feel like maybe, just maybe, you were pulling life together one cheap noodle at a time. And in those quick, quiet moments, it almost tasted like victory. Hamburger corn bake was one of those dinners that made the whole house smell like something good was happening, even when nothing else was. You browned a pound of ground beef in a pan, stirred in a can of creamed corn, maybe some onion, and poured the whole thing into a baking dish. Then you mixed up some cornbread batter, Jiffy, if you were smart and short on time, and poured it over the top. Baked it until the cornbread puffed up golden and cracked just a little at the edges. It came out hot, steamy, and smelling like Sunday dinner on a Tuesday. The sweetness of the corn played against the savory beef, and that soft layer of cornbread on top soaked it all in like a sponge. You didn't need sides, you didn't need seconds, but you took them anyway. It was the kind of meal that shut kids up and made adults sit down. It was filling without being fussy, warm without being heavy. It made you forget for a minute that everything in it came from a can, a box, or a pound wrapped in plastic. Because on that plate, it all came together like comfort should. Chili cheese dogs weren't just dinner, they were an event. You boiled or grilled the hot dogs, lined them up on soft buns, then drowned them in canned chili. Not the fancy kind, just meat and beans and grease. Then came the shredded cheddar piled so high it melted into the cracks. Maybe you sprinkled chopped onions on top if you were brave. You served them on paper plates because the mess was biblical. Kids loved them. Dads swore by them. Friday nights in front of the game or Saturdays with friends in the garage, this was the food that brought people together. It wasn't healthy, it wasn't pretty, but it was loud, messy, and completely satisfying. You didn't eat just one. You ate 2 or 3 and felt it for the rest of the night. But no one cared. Because for those 10 greasy, cheesy minutes, you weren't worried about bills or work or anything else. You were just eating something that tasted good, with people you liked, with napkins stacked high and bellies filling fast. It was dinner you remembered, not because it was fancy, but because it was real. Swiss steak was how you made a tough piece of meat taste like Sunday supper. You started with a cheap cut, round steak mostly, pounded it flat with a mallet or the back of a pan, dredged it in flour, salt, and pepper, then seared it in oil until it browned. Then came the sauce, canned tomatoes, sliced onions, and bell peppers. Simmered low and slow for hours until the meat gave up and went fork tender. It wasn't steak like restaurants served. It was home cooking. Rustic. A little sour. A lot of comforting. The gravy went over mashed potatoes or white rice or just souped up with bread. Moms made it on stovetops while laundry turned and kids did homework at the table. Dads came home from long days to the smell of something real. It stretched one piece of meat into enough for 4 or 5 plates. It taught you patience. It taught you thrift. And even when you didn't love the taste, you ate every bite because someone took the time to make it. In that slow simmering pot was the quiet love of a working kitchen, the kind that didn't ask for praise. Just a clean plate. Breakfast for dinner, BFD, was the lifeline of every tired parent who forgot to thaw meat. You scrambled up eggs, maybe tossed in some cheese if it hadn't gone moldy, pancakes from a box mix, bacon or sausage if there was any left from Sunday, hash browns fried from frozen, crispy on the outside and soft in the middle. You ate it all at the dinner table like it was completely normal, because in your house it was. It felt like breaking the rules and being responsible at the same time. Kids loved it. Adults appreciated it. And something about pancakes at 6 p.m. just made the day feel less hard. You didn't need a recipe. You didn't need much of anything. Just a hot pan, a little butter, and the willingness to bend tradition. You cleaned out the fridge and called it a meal. Syrup on the eggs? Why not? Toast and jelly on the side? Sure, it was the great equalizer. Everyone liked something from the breakfast menu. And when dinner felt impossible, flipping flapjacks at sundown made you feel like you were still in control, if only for one syrupy, scrambled, golden brown night. SOS was the kind of dinner that felt like a military march straight to the kitchen table. It stood for chipped beef and white gravy over toast, but every working dad knew the other name, something salty and a little vulgar, just like the meal itself. You could find jars of dried beef tucked away in pantries, next to flour, coffee, and old soup cans. All it took was some butter, flour, and milk to whip up the white gravy. Pour it hot over toasted bread and you had dinner in 10 minutes. It was not fancy, and it definitely was not pretty, but it was warm, rich, and cheap, something you could rely on when the paycheck had to stretch. For many blue-collar families, it was a hand-me-down from army service or factory life. Something about it stuck, maybe because it always filled the plate, even when the fridge felt empty. Chili rice bake was the kind of casserole that slid out of the oven smelling like something much fancier. But it was just cooked white rice, a can of beans, some chili powder, and a handful of cheddar cheese. You would mix it all together in a dish and bake it until it bubbled. For families watching every dollar, this was how you stretched one can of kidney beans into dinner for 4. It did not splash or stain like chili on the stovetop, and there were fewer pots to clean. Dads would scoop big spoonfuls onto plates and let the cheese melt over the top. It was warm and soft, with just enough spice to feel special. Not quite chili and not quite rice, but something in between that worked better than expected. It was a Wednesday night kind of meal, when no one wanted to cook and everyone needed comfort. Tuna patties came together fast and quiet. Just canned tuna, breadcrumbs, egg, and a frying pan. There was something humble about them. No one bragged about eating them, but everyone cleaned their plates. They were flaky and golden when done right, the outside crisp and the inside still soft. Served with saltine crackers or maybe a side of peas, it was a fish dinner that worked when meat prices were out of reach. Moms and dads knew how to stretch a can of tuna across the whole table, and this was how. You could add lemon if you had it, or mustard if you were bold. But most kept it plain, just like the week. They tasted like a concession, something you made do with, but still came with a full belly and a quiet nod. Tuna patties were not fancy, but they were steady. And sometimes steady was all dinner needed to be. Polish sausage with sauerkraut had a way of filling up the house before it ever filled a plate. The tang of kraut and the sizzle of sliced kielbasa told you dinner was coming, fast and cheap. This was a no-frills kind of meal, often cooked in a single pan with onions and butter. Rye bread on the side was a luxury. Usually, it was just served up with boiled potatoes or on its own. The sausage was smoky and fat-rich, and the kraut cut right through it, balancing each bite. It was a meal from old neighborhoods, Slavic, German, or just working-class America, where pork and cabbage never went out of style. It stuck to your ribs and left a scent that lingered for hours. Dads made this when they had 30 minutes and hungry mouths to feed. It was not glamorous, it was not delicate, but it was proud and loud and enough. Cornflake crusted chicken was a genius twist on fried chicken without the grease or the mess. Someone figured out you could smash up cornflakes, roll your chicken in it, and bake it until golden. Suddenly, moms had something crispy and fun that cost less and cooked faster. You did not need buttermilk or oil, just a box of cereal and a hot oven. It felt inventive, like dinner made from the pantry instead of the store. The crunch was real. Kids loved it, even if the chicken underneath was dry from overbaking. Sometimes it came with a side of macaroni and cheese or a can of green beans. But even alone, it held its own. The cornflakes turned something plain into something proud. It felt like a trick you were getting away with. For working families, that was more than enough. It was not Southern fried, but it was ours. Cabbage and noodles or haluski did not need meat to matter. Just butter, onions, egg noodles, and green cabbage, chopped and cooked until everything softened together. It came from Eastern Europe, but in the American Midwest, it became everyday fare. The smell was unmistakable, like sweet onion and fried hope. This was the meal made when the fridge was near empty, when payday was far away. But it had warmth. Butter coated everything. The noodles were soft and thick. You ate it in silence, maybe with a slice of bread, and felt full in a way that was more than physical. Cabbage was cheap, noodles cheaper, and somehow together they made a dish that stuck with you. Dads would serve big scoops onto chipped plates. Kids would groan until they took a bite. Then the complaints faded. No frills, no protein, just flavor, fat, and something that strangely felt like love. Enchilada Casserole was the shortcut no one complained about. Rolling tortillas took too long, especially on a weekday, so you just layered everything in a pan like lasagna. Canned enchilada sauce, shredded cheese, ground beef, maybe black olives if you had them. It baked into a gooey, spicy, bubbling slab that you cut with a spatula and scooped onto plates. Served with sour cream or just plain, it was hearty, hot, and fast. Moms would make a double batch and freeze half. Dads would come home late, pop it in the microwave, and call it good. It had that Tex-Mex spirit without needing any real effort. Kids loved it for the cheese. Adults loved it for the leftovers. It was not authentic, but it was efficient, and it stayed in rotation long after the first time it was made, because like most casseroles from those years, it was more about survival than style. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze was the star of so many weeknights. Now, ketchup glazes might sound like an affront to all that is holy in terms of meatloafs, but hear this one out. You might just be surprised at what you end up finding out. It was dependable, filling, and easy to stretch. Ground beef, breadcrumbs, egg, onion, and whatever seasoning was within reach, shaped into a loaf, baked until firm, and slathered with ketchup near the end. It came out steaming, smelling like every family dinner from memory. Slices were thick and tender, often served with instant mashed potatoes and canned corn. Some families added cheese, others mixed in oats or chopped carrots to make it go further. But the ketchup glaze, shiny, tangy, sweet, was the crown. It gave meatloaf its identity, but it was different enough to stay in your mind even after that last bite. Dads would slice it like a roast. Leftovers became sandwiches. It was one of the few dinners where no one asked questions. Everyone just ate. And that was enough, because meatloaf meant routine, stability, and one more night the bills were paid and the kids went to bed full. Spam fried rice was what you made when time was short and leftovers were plenty. A little rice, a little spam, a few peas or carrots, maybe a scrambled egg thrown in. It was comfort in a can during the best of times. It was a carb-loaded silver lining in the worst of times. Either way, it was always a friend you could count on when your stomach and energy were running on empty. It came together in one pan, fast and salty. Spam was the star, cubed, seared until crispy at the edges, and rich enough to make everything else taste like something more expensive. It was equal parts convenience and comfort. This was the kind of meal passed down from soldiers in island kitchens from Hawaii to Arkansas. No matter where you grew up, someone you knew made this. It was not glamorous, but it was golden in the pan and gone in minutes. Dads especially liked it. Quick to make, easy to clean. The soy sauce gave it color. The Spam gave it soul. And the rice soaked up every bit of it. One skillet, one spoon, one full belly. Minute steak and canned green beans was not cooked with joy. It was cooked with necessity. You took thin budget cuts of steak, tough as shoe leather unless you seared them quick, and slapped them in a hot pan. A little salt, a little pepper, maybe some onion powder. Then you opened a can of green beans and poured it into a pot. That was dinner. Maybe there were instant mashed potatoes on the side if there was time. But usually it was just meat and greens on a chipped plate. Dads came home tired. This was what they made when there was nothing left to give. It was hot, it was fast, and it filled the space. There were no seconds, just silence. But sometimes that silence meant something got done. It kept the week moving. It kept the lights on. Not every meal was a celebration. Some were just a breath. A quiet moment in the chaos. A simple act of care when words were too heavy to say aloud. Once a staple of dinner parties and homecoming feasts, this elegant yet simple side dish was a favorite among home cooks looking to add a touch of sophistication to their meals. Crisp, tender green beans, lightly sautéed in butter and finished with toasted almonds, struck the perfect balance between freshness and richness. Green beans were one of the most accessible vegetables in American kitchens. Whether fresh, frozen, or canned, they were affordable and widely available year-round. Almonds, though slightly more expensive, were used sparingly, adding a crunchy contrast without overwhelming the dish. The preparation was straightforward. The beans were quickly blanched to preserve their bright color and firm texture, then tossed in a buttery skillet with slivered almonds for a nutty, golden brown finish. Some recipes included a squeeze of lemon or a sprinkle of garlic for extra depth. But as convenience cooking took hold, green bean almondine slowly faded from dinner tables. Canned green bean casseroles, loaded with processed ingredients, became the new standard, and simple, fresh preparations were overlooked in favor of heavier, creamier alternatives. Gooseberry and elk were one of the most prized dishes that Native Americans would make regularly. This was because elk was one of the most treasured animals they had. In the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Northwest, and the Great Plains, all sorts of tribes were known for how much they prioritized elk usage. This is because elk was something that was beneficial overall, just like deers and bison. The hides wouldn't just be used for clothing. A good quality elk hide, or one that was prized in towns like a white hide, would actually go for a fair amount of resources. They were also something that would provide meat for literally months. Even one elk was a game changer for a tribe going through tough times. They were dried for later use all the time, and the most valuable cuts were always kept for slow roasting so that they could have a great meal out of it. It was preserved for special ceremonies and hunting feasts, which would usually occur during the summer when gooseberries were also in harvest. A roasted elk haunch with some gooseberry sauce was enough food for an entire family or an entire hunting party. So, imagine what it could do for us today. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone, Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. For generations, baked cod was a dependable, no-fuss dinner, particularly in coastal and New England households. Light, flaky, and mild in flavor, cod was one of the most affordable fish available, making it a practical choice for families looking to put a nutritious meal on the table without overspending. Topped with a crisp breadcrumb and herb crust, this dish was both simple and satisfying, proof that great cooking didn't need to be complicated. Cod's popularity was tied to its abundance. Throughout much of the 20th century, fresh or frozen cod was readily available at grocery stores and fish markets, and it didn't require elaborate preparation. A coating of breadcrumbs, butter, and fresh herbs locked in moisture while creating a crunchy golden brown topping. Baked rather than fried, this dish had a lighter texture, making it a favorite among those who wanted something hearty without being heavy. So why did it disappear? Overfishing led to shortages, making cod more expensive, and as frozen fish sticks and pre-breaded fillies flooded supermarkets, many home cooks stopped preparing fish from scratch. Acorn squash was an incredibly popular cultivated vegetable among many different kinds of tribes. Squash in itself is something the Native Americans experimented with a fair amount. All of that effort eventually brought about the Three Sisters agricultural method, which was basically just growing crops of corn, beans, and squash together. The way they grew helped the other plants grow, so they were always grown together because the end result was more fantastic than if they were grown individually. Sweetening squash with maple syrup was also something that was popular among tribes who were centered around maple syrups, and I don't know if you know this, but tapping into maple trees for the syrup was a very common practice of the Native American peoples. They were arguably better at it than anyone else too, especially because of how much they valued maple syrup as a natural sweetener. Some tribes genuinely loved to have it without the syrup, though. They would slice it and dry the squash in the sun for long-term storage. For generations, lamb was a prized centerpiece of homecoming feasts and holiday gatherings. Its deep, rich flavor and fall-apart tenderness made it a dish reserved for special occasions, especially in families with European or Mediterranean roots. Slow roasting a lamb shoulder with garlic and fresh herbs was a time-honored tradition. Lamb was once far more common on American dinner tables than it is today. In the early 20th century, it was an affordable alternative to beef and pork, particularly in rural areas where small-scale farming was the norm. Shoulder cuts were especially budget-friendly, benefiting from long, slow cooking to break down tough fibers. Roasted low and slow with rosemary, thyme, and whole cloves of garlic, the meat absorbed deep, aromatic flavors while becoming melt-in-your-mouth tender. So why did it disappear from everyday meals? As industrial farming shifted American preferences toward beef and chicken, lamb fell out of favor. It became harder to find in grocery stores, and for many home cooks, its distinctive flavor was an acquired taste. Faster, more convenient proteins replaced slow-cooked roasts, and over time, this once popular dish faded into obscurity. Corn husk-wrapped tamales have incredibly deep roots in a lot of Mesoamerican cultures. I know you might not really associate them with a lot of different ethnic groups, but it's genuinely something a lot of them have used throughout their history. There were specific tribes like the Pueblo and Hopi that had very agricultural lifestyles, and the Pueblo even had trade and cultural connections with Mesoamerican civilizations. They would share their knowledge with Mexican cultures, and in return, the Mexicans would share theirs. and that's how Native American tribes first became familiar with the idea of tamales. They were already very used to working with dried corn kernels and grounding them into masa. Also, these are a lot different from the typical tamales you might be used to because they usually rely on bison, venison, and rabbit. And each of those has its unique world of flavor different from the chicken and beef we're so used to on the corners of our streets. If you're looking for a fresh spin, try to hit up an authentic Native American joint or work with some venison or rabbit at home. You might be pretty surprised. Hogging an entire hog for yourself was a great hobby for Native Americans. Steamed clams, a beloved dish especially along the coasts of New England, have been enjoyed for generations. This dish is a true celebration of seafood, as fresh clams are steamed until tender, absorbing all the flavors of the broth, often seasoned with garlic, herbs, and a splash of white wine or broth. Clams, which are bivalve mollusks, have been a staple in coastal cuisine for centuries, with Native Americans harvesting them long before European settlers arrived. The joy of eating steamed clams comes from their delicate texture and briny sweetness. The perfect clam should pop open easily when steamed, a sign that it's cooked just right. Paired with a slice of hearty brown bread and a dollop of butter, this dish becomes a complete, satisfying meal. The richness of the butter and the rustic flavor of the brown bread perfectly complement the clam's natural saltiness, creating a balanced, indulgent experience. Steamed clams with brown bread, because sometimes the best meals are the ones that come with their own dipping sauce. The dish reflects the simplicity of coastal living, proving that the freshest ingredients often make the most memorable meals. Whether served as an appetizer or a main course, steamed clams with brown bread and butter remain a timeless favorite, offering a taste of the sea with every bite. If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right. Those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available, no need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. Native American preparations of stuffed roast duck usually included some common themes like wild rice, corn and beans, acorns, and nuts, but it varied region by region. What really makes this such a standout recipe for dinners is that it is quite literally an entire stuffed duck. This is also something you need such as minimal appliances for making. It can be its own little day too. So, if you're feeling like calling a friend over and brushing up your cooking skills over the weekend, this might be a good idea. The stuffing is also not something you need to worry about too much because it's not that hard to make. In California and the Southwest, ground acorns and pine nuts had a long tradition of being thickened into stuffing, and this was usually for pies, but the Native Americans thought it was better with ducks. The use of berries and fruits is definitely something I'm not used to, though, and I don't think a lot of people are. Many tribes like the Cherokee and Lenape would use dried cranberries and choke cherries in a fair amount of recipes, but in terms of stuffed duck, it was always used to add a bit of an extra sweetness to it. I think the most difficult part of this might be just managing the bird, because Native Americans would roast the duck whole. This is obviously something we aren't really used to, but if you really want to get authentic with it, you should try cooking it over an open fire. This ensured a lot more even cooking, and the meat would get really tender on the inside, besides just having a slightly smokier flavor. And that's never a bad thing. Slow cooking was once an art form, and few dishes showcased it better than a well-braised short rib. This was a meal that required patience. Tough cuts of beef transformed into fork-tender perfection after hours of simmering in a rich, aromatic sauce. Deeply savory, fall-off-the-bone ribs were the reward for anyone willing to wait. Short ribs were once considered a budget cut, prized not for their tenderness, but for their flavor when cooked properly. Unlike steaks or roasts, these ribs needed time and care to break down the tough connective tissue. The solution was a slow braise in red wine, broth, and aromatic vegetables. Over several hours, the flavors deepened, and the meat absorbed every note of the wine's richness, creating a dish that was as elegant as it was hearty. For much of the 20th century, this was a homecoming dinner classic, perfect for cold evenings and special occasions. But as cooking habits changed, so did the popularity of slow-braised dishes. People wanted quick meals, not ones that took all afternoon. Short ribs also became more expensive as demand for premium beef cuts soared, making them less common in everyday kitchens. If you believe that eating insects is a modern, sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke. They were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. When it comes to simple yet elegant meals, few combinations can match the light, flaky fish paired with the richness of lemon butter and the crispness of asparagus. Baked cod or halibut are perfect choices for this dish. Both are mild white fish that take well to a variety of seasonings, but it's the lemon butter that steals the show, bringing a burst of freshness that complements the delicate flavors of the fish. Cod and halibut have been long favorites in American kitchens, especially along the coastlines where they are abundant. Cod, with its firm texture, has been a staple in New England since the colonial era, while halibut is prized for its mild taste and large fillets. Both fish are low in fat but high in protein, making them an excellent choice for a healthy, satisfying dinner. Asparagus, often served alongside fish in this dish, is packed with vitamins and minerals, making it a nutritious addition. The key to a great asparagus side is cooking it just enough to maintain its crunch, while the lemon butter ties everything together in perfect harmony. A meal like this is a reminder that simple ingredients can create something extraordinary. For families stretching their grocery budget, few meals delivered as much flavor and comfort as these unusual-looking meatballs. A product of the Great Depression and wartime rationing, porcupine meatballs were a creative way to make ground beef go further. Mixing rice into the meat wasn't just for texture. It bulked up the meal, making a pound of beef feed more mouths. Rice was an affordable pantry staple, and when the meatballs simmered in a tangy tomato sauce, the grains softened and expanded, giving them their signature spiky appearance. Despite the name, no porcupines were harmed in the making of this dish. Just a bit of kitchen ingenuity at work. Some recipes used canned tomato soup for a mild, creamy sauce, while others relied on crushed tomatoes and Worcestershire sauce for a sharper kick. Either way, the slow cooking process allowed the flavors to meld into a hearty, stick-to-your-ribs meal. For decades, this dish was a go-to for busy home cooks. It was easy, required minimal ingredients, and could be made in one pot, ideal for feeding a growing family. But as convenience foods and pre-made meatballs filled grocery store freezers, the homemade version started to disappear. Who says you need apples to make an apple pie? Not the Depression era, folks, that's for sure. This mock apple pie was a genius hack that used Ritz crackers as the crust and a sweet, sticky filling made from sugar, cinnamon, and water. It was a budget-friendly dessert that satisfied the sweet tooth without the need for expensive or hard-to-find ingredients. Plus, it was a great way to use up those stale crackers lurking in the back of your pantry. The Ritz mock apple pie became a Depression-era favorite, despite the fact that it was a pastry imposter. How did it work? The aromatic mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, lemon juice, and crackers combined to convince the taster's senses that the pie actually tasted of apples. Mock apple pie actually dates to the mid-1800s. During the wintertime, when apples were scarce and dried apple stores were used up, inventive home cooks would instead use soda crackers or stale bread. The more modern Ritz cracker version came about in the 1930s. For years, cornbread stuffed pork tenderloin was a homecoming dinner favorite, combining the rich, juicy flavors of pork with the comforting, slightly sweet notes of cornbread dressing. It was the kind of meal that felt celebratory but was made with everyday ingredients. Pork tenderloin was an affordable cut, prized for its tenderness and quick cooking time. Cornbread, a staple in southern and midwestern kitchens, made the perfect stuffing, absorbing the juices from the meat while adding its signature crumbly texture. Sage and dried cranberries brought a hint of warmth and sweetness, making this dish a natural fit for fall and winter gatherings. Some versions included pecans for extra crunch, while others used sausage to double down on the savory depth. So why did this dish fade from dinner tables? As boneless, pre-seasoned pork cuts became common, elaborate stuffed roasts became less appealing to the average home cook. The extra steps of butterflying, filling, and tying up a tenderloin made it feel like a holiday dish rather than a weeknight option. But for those who appreciate the balance of savory pork and buttery cornbread, this is a recipe that deserves a second look, because some traditions are too good to leave behind. Salmon patties, a classic dish found in many American homes, offer a tasty and affordable way to enjoy fish. Often made with canned salmon, these patties are mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and seasonings, then fried to golden perfection. The dish has roots in the 1940s, when canned fish became a popular pantry staple due to its long shelf life and affordability during tough economic times. Despite being simple, salmon patties are packed with protein, omega-3 fatty acids, and heart-healthy nutrients, making them both a tasty and nutritious choice. The secret to a great salmon patty lies in its texture, crispy on the outside, yet tender and flaky on the inside. Often paired with a generous helping of creamed peas, this dish takes on a comforting, homey feel. Creamed peas are made by cooking fresh or frozen peas in a creamy sauce, sometimes enhanced with butter, milk, and a touch of seasoning. The creamy, mild flavor of the peas balances the richness of the salmon patties, creating a perfectly matched duo. Salmon patties with creamed peas are the kind of comfort food that makes you think, "Why did I ever stop eating this?" It's an easy, satisfying meal that stood the test of time, offering comfort with every bite. Back in the day, when you were out of just about everything except sugar, flour, and fruit, a vinegar cobbler was your only option. No surprise that it was also known as one of the famous desperation pies. Desperation pies are pies in American cuisine made using staple ingredients like butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and any other ingredients that cooks had on hand to complement them or substitute for ingredients that were out of season or too expensive. These pies were more common before refrigeration and canned pie fillings, and during times of hardship like the Great Depression and rationing of World War II. When fresh fruits were hard to come by, people turned to vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruits like apples and lemons. This cobbler used a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices to create a filling that, when baked, tasted surprisingly similar to a fruit cobbler. Instead of chunks of fresh apples, those on a budget would use apple cider vinegar to fake the acidic taste. The crust was made from basic pantry staples like flour, sugar, and butter or lard. The dish reportedly tasted like a custard made from salt and vinegar chips, a rare dessert that leaves the roof of your mouth tingling. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world, since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. Fish sticks, those crispy, golden-breaded delights, have been a fixture of American family dinners since the mid-20th century. While their origins date back to the early 1950s, when commercial frozen food production boomed, fish sticks quickly became a go-to for busy families. Made from white fish, typically cod or pollock, these little rectangular pieces of seafood are battered and deep-fried to perfection, making them as crunchy on the outside as they are tender on the inside. The classic pairing of fish sticks with tartar sauce elevates the meal. Tartar sauce, a tangy combination of mayonnaise, pickles, and lemon juice, adds a creamy contrast to the crispy fish. While the sauce has its roots in French cuisine, it became a beloved accompaniment to fish and chips, and later to fish sticks in the US. On the side, coleslaw, a salad made from finely shredded raw cabbage, carrots, and a tangy dressing, has been a popular addition to fish dishes for generations. Its crisp texture and slightly sweet flavor balance out the richness of the fish and tartar sauce. Venison is one of the most common meats throughout all of history, so it's no surprise that the Native Americans have their own nutty take on it as well. In forests and grasslands, deer would usually thrive a lot more than what we're used to. There used to be, like, massive packs of them roaming around everywhere. Before the 20th century, also, the American chestnut tree was in its golden years. It was devastated later by regional hazards and blight. Chestnuts were something that were available all over eastern woodlands, so it was very easy to forage them and gather them for emergency situations. Venison was always a staple meat for all kinds of tribes, especially the Cherokee, Shawnee, and Algonquians. Deer was something that was respected by tribes for how much the animal would take care of them. It would give them hides for clothing, the sinew was used for tools, and the bones were used in medicinal broths and kept for trading or for hunting tools. The meat was also very flavorful and important for making pemmican, which was a superfood essential to the Native Americans. Venison was usually cut into cubes and put into a broth with roasted and peeled chestnuts. They would be fond of using Jerusalem artichokes, squash, and wild onions as well, so stock up on your root vegetables before trying this. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly-sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Few dishes command attention quite like a well-prepared crown roast. Traditionally served at homecoming dinners and holiday gatherings, it was the kind of dish that made guests stop and admire before the first bite. The ring of bone-in pork chops, arranged in a regal circle, was as much about presentation as it was about flavor. For families looking to impress without breaking the bank, the pork crown roast was a surprisingly economical choice. Pork was, and still is, one of the most affordable meats, and butchers often offered deals on bulk cuts. The apricot glaze, a key feature of this recipe, added just the right balance of sweetness and depth, while a bread-based stuffing packed the center for an even heartier meal. Preparing this dish took skill and patience. The roast had to be properly Frenched, tied, and slow-cooked to achieve that juicy, tender texture. But for many home cooks, the challenge was worth the reward. Unfortunately, as home butchering became a lost art and families shifted toward convenience meals, the crown roast started to disappear from dinner tables. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, be sure to like and subscribe for more nostalgic food stories. See you next time.